Ah, dear listeners, it has been far too long. It is my honor to speak to you once again, to tell you we are most delighted with our beloved Jeremiah's upcoming interview. Prognosticating the prestigious presence permitted through our most precious parapets is a man whose work has ushered in the acceptance of video gaming soundtracks as a true art form. His piece, Baba Yetu, played over the cultural touchstone of video games that is Civilization 4, is seen as a landmark composition in the medium, and the venerable Mr. Christopher Tin shows no signs of slowing, having very recently released his latest album, To Shiver the Sky. Mr. Tin, the skies above the Fanitarium shiver in anticipation of your arrival, of the music of not only your melodies but your musings. You grant us the privilege of your company and conversation. We hope in return you accept the warmest of welcomes to the Fanitarium.
And with that, welcome back to the show, Mr. Christopher Tin. After I think it's 3 years or fairly close in there. Probably maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, somewhere 3-ish years ago. Welcome
Yeah, I
back.
think it's 2016-ish that we chatted. So yeah, it's nice to be back.
And interesting thing, last time we talked about civilization themes. We talked about some of your first albums. The first song on this album was talked about then because of Civ 6.
Civ 6. Yep.
Yes, and it's an interesting evolution for how your journey went. And this album, well, just knowing how the world went, seemed to be significantly more of a challenge in some ways than you probably ever expected it to be. Because this was originally slated to come out last September, right? Am I right?
Yes, it was. I mean, according to the Kickstarter promise that I made, I funded it in, I think, March of 2018, and I said I'll be done by September 2019. But the world went a little haywire. But in reality, what caused the delay, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, and we've been talking offline about this too, I became a first-time dad in that span of time. And oh my God, I had no idea how much that would just destroy my productivity. And so that's truly the reason why the album was delayed. I mean, the pandemic definitely delayed it as well. Fortunately, I was able to finish recording just the week that things were starting to go haywire and flights were being canceled, and I was able to just finish it just in time. But then the post-production schedule got totally thrown apart because of the quarantine. So,
And
that's just
the
the
live
world we live
show
in.
and stuff like that too. The concerts and the
Yeah. I mean, within the span of a couple of weeks, I had two major concerts canceled, and I mean, it's just hard. It's hard on musicians everywhere these days.
and I have lots of friends who are actors who work for places like Medieval Times and so on, and it's rough. It's very rough. And they do what they can. But I will say, when it comes to this album, I've listened to your other albums a lot, and a lot of them are kind of like how does my wife describe it? That's kind of like a travelogue of music.
Yeah.
As you travel around the world and you like get to travel and hear different sounds, different voices. I really love your Maori song. And of course, Baba Yetu is Swahili. You get to hear all these different cultures in this. While this album, it took me a little bit to get used to it because this one is more like a something that like Mozart or Beethoven would do, where it's a straight like concerto beginning to end. It's one thought rather than traveling around. It's more focused, which took me a little bit to get used to because I was like, oh, I wonder which language this is in. Oh, this is not. That's not a different language. Okay, let's keep on going. But it's definitely more. It's more focused. It's more of a classical style, if I dare say.
Yeah. I mean, I like to describe it as kind of operatic in a way. I mean, yes. it's very rich. It sounds like Verdi or Puccini or Wagner. I mean, I happen to love opera, and I thought that what I would do with this album, like I did with my first album, Calling All Dawns, is I would take a theme that I wrote for Civilization, and I would just kind of expand it and turn it into a full-on symphonic piece. And that's what happened with the new album, To Shiver the Sky. I took the Civilization 6 theme, which is called Sonia De Volare, and it's a setting of Leonardo da Vinci's writings on flight, right? And it's sung in Italian. It sounds very classical and like operatic. And I said, okay, so if we're going to expand this, let's kind of stay in that lane, right? Let's stay sort of classical. And rather than sort of a romp around the world, like sampling, the vocal flavors of different ethnic vocal traditions and people out there, like this one's more of like a romp through history in a way. And like the style of the movements like sort of evolves as we progress through the centuries. The core narrative in To Shiver the Sky is it's an album about the history of flight. And so it takes the words of 11 of history's pioneers of flight, people from Amelia Earhart, Leonardo da Vinci, Yuri Gagarin, to John F. Kennedy, to Jules Verne. It takes all of their writings and it sets them to music in a chronological order. So you're basically tracing the history of mankind's quest to achieve human flight, starting from Da Vinci and ending on John F. Kennedy's amazing moon landing speech, where he challenges the nation and says, "We choose to go to the moon." That's the entire dramatic arc of it. So I was telling a very specific story, which is probably why you feel that this album is sort of focused in sound.
Questions. I noticed that the Royal Opera chorus is in most of this album, and it's on the first song. Did you re-record Sonia De Volare, or is this the original recording that you did, and it just happened to have them?
This is a new recording, actually, and I mean, okay, this goes back to me being an opera fan. I spent a couple of years in England studying. Like, I did my graduate school there at a conservatory called the Royal College of Music. And, one of the things you do as a student in London, a music student, is you get access to cheap tickets to things, right? So I spent a lot of time loafing around around Covent Garden, the Royal Opera House, right? And I saw a lot of opera there. And that quickly became just one of my favorite singing ensembles right there, the chorus of the Royal Opera House. It's such a rich, rich sound, like so rich. And I thought, this is perfect for Sonia De Volare. I always knew I was going to re-record the piece, with like the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra and Abbey Road, and the Royal Opera Chorus just turned out to be the best possible group of singers for that re-recording.
Interesting. Now I want to listen to them back to like both recordings. Singing. I could pull up Civ 6 right now if I wanted to, but I'd probably crash my computer. But who did you use for the original recording?
Okay. So the original recording, the choir was a combination of 24 singers in San Francisco called Capella SF. They're a professional chamber choir, and the Angel City Chorale, which is about 120 members here in LA where I live, and they're a community choir, mostly made up of volunteers. So that recording was made with sort of a combination of like the more classical vocal sound, but also just the mass of a large community choir. The orchestra was made up of string players from Macedonia who recorded their parts remotely. I was in LA and I, listened in on their session while they recorded in Macedonia. And then brass players recorded here in LA. So that recording is really this weird sort of amalgamation of a lot of different things, And that's why it sounds maybe a little sort of like flatter but punchier. It was mixed to be, everything up front, everything sort of compressed and in your face and sort of sweetened with sound effects and samples and low frequency booms and that sort of thing. So that is a great sound for something like a video game or a movie trailer or something. But if you really want to shape almost an hour-long classical work around a piece, you can't have that level of density for a full hour. It starts to sound like trailer music, or it gets a little fatiguing. You sort of lose the dynamic range. That's why I wanted to re-record the song, and that's why there's two versions out there now. I think they both cater to a different type of listener, I think.
Yeah, and also, when people are listening to music, you're usually expecting a certain level of fidelity and certain depth of sound. While you're playing a video game, honestly, I turn music down a lot because I can't hear voices half the time if I put the music as loud as I'd usually put it. And then the game gets significantly more complex when you don't hear what anyone's saying because you listen to the music so much.
Mm-hmm.
And you listen to when you play video games, you don't always have the best headsets on, and so on. I will say, though, there's one track on this album that really kind of mesmerized me. And I've listened to it often a lot today because I'm doing remote learning at school. I can listen to a lot of stuff, and I was having a hard time focusing because it's really hard to focus when everything's online and you're waiting for people to contact you. I'm a counselor, so people have to come to me, and they don't. But the fall is like a hypnotizingly beautiful song. The aria, I believe it's called an aria to start with. That throughout the first half of the song is mesmerizing. So you said all this is related to different words on flight. What was the inspiration for the fall? Because I just find it absolutely beautiful and mesmerizing for the soloist especially.
Okay, so very early on, well, thank you, first of all. And that song seems to be a bit of a hit. Um, Early on, I knew I didn't want this album just to be about, the words of this great pilot or this great astronaut, this person who broke this record or this person who did this first. I also wanted to talk about the people behind the scenes, like whether it's the astronomers or the poets or the science fiction writers like Jules Verne. Like there's a whole sort of a backstory behind the story of mankind challenging the heavens that extends well beyond like science and engineering, but expands into things like religion and the sort of the quest for who we are spiritually, right? The fall came about because I encountered an amazing quote from Dante Alighieri, and in his Divine Comedy, he has this quote that says, "O mankind, born to fly, wherefore at a little wind dost thou fall?" And I thought, oh my God, that's such an amazing quote. I just love that. I got to find something to do with this, right? And so the fall was born of that. And I really sort of explored this concept of the fall. Like I spent a lot of time thinking about, concepts and making connections between music and the greater world of literature and art history and history in general. And, I wanted this piece to be something that not only signified, the failures of the trying to achieve flight, but also had a deeper sort of spiritual dimension, something that related to the fall of man, right? That spoke to literature about heaven and hell and angels and demons and that sort of thing. And hence this piece sort of took on this sort of mystical quality in a way, right? And the words that you hear the singers sing in the very opening are that quote, "O mankind, born to fly, wherefore art at a little wind dost thou fall." The middle portion of the album, or that particular track, the opera chorus comes in. They sort of beckon the hero back to his feet. And the final section, which is a reprise of the Sonia De Volare theme, it's sort of the chapter where the hero climbs out of the darkness, and it ends with the great last line of Dante's Inferno, where he says, "Thenceforth we came forward to re-behold the stars," which was a perfect way to end a piece like this. You fall, you're sort of mired at the bottom of the pit of despair, and you climb back up and you see the stars, right? It works so well in the context of an album about the history of flight. And that's how I came across that structure and that piece.
And it works so well following, a track about Icarus, which
Exactly. And I'm
Icarus
so glad.
falls.
Exactly. I'm so glad you're picking up on this stuff because track 3 tells the Daedalus and Icarus myth. And at the very end, the tenor I brought in, an amazing young New Zealand tenor, he's the next Pavarotti, I'm telling you, named Pene Patti. He sings basically the words, Icarus, Icarus, where are you? And that's because his son Icarus has fallen out of the sky into the ocean. And he sings that like, that's the same melodic phrase that starts off the beginning of the fall. And it's, in a way, the fall is just a response to Icarus asking, where his son went. He can't find his son. He just fell into the ocean. And the answer that comes from the fall is, O mankind born to fly, wherefore as the little wind dost thou fall? I mean, I thought poetically it worked so well. And that's the other thing I tried to achieve with this album. Like the idea of, like taking the lyrics and lining them up, one after the other. There are lyrical connections that lead from one track to the other. So at the end of the fall, you say, like the translation is, thenceforth we came forward to re-behold the stars. The next movement is called Astronomy, and it's about the stars. And this album is full of little Easter eggs and little connective tissue like that.
And Pene Pade shows up in 4 tracks, I believe. Let's talk about some of the people that you feature in this one, because we talked about the Royal Opera Chorus. You just introduced one of your soloists, but you have lots of other different groups and people who helped you with this one. So the female soloist, I believe, is Danielle Denise.
Danielle Denise, yes, she's a big-time opera singer, and fantastic to work with. Big name in the opera world.
And then you have
a brilliant singer. She
has what?
I was just saying, she happened to be in LA when I was wrapping up recording. She was singing at the LA Opera. Nice. She was debuting the title role in a new opera by Matthew Aucoin. And I went to see her, and my agent reached out to her. My manager reached out to her manager. My people talked to her people and sent her the rough demos, and she loved the song. And so after, on one of her days off, she just came over to my studio and then recorded. And I mean, she's fantastic. She's so good.
So she's like a huge get for this one.
Yeah, she's got some star power.
So then you also had Modern Medieval is a group that joined in on 4 tracks, I believe.
Yeah, they're the ones who sing that opening of the fall. That's sort of like that trade-off, that echoing effect. They're a new early music group that was formed out of the ashes of a group called Anonymous 4, which sings on my previous albums, right? Anonymous 4 retired. One of their members started a new group. It's called Modern Medieval. If you've heard my previous albums, you know that I'm sort of a fan of that sort of monastic sound, right?
Yeah.
That's the early music sound. And it's very popular. That type of straight tone, no vibrato, pure angelic sort of sound is very popular for early music, but actually it's kind of popular for contemporary classical avant-garde music as well. So that's why they're called Modern Medieval.
And then you had another one called The Assembly, which showed up on 4 tracks as well, I believe.
The Assembly is just a name I gave to my own little group of session singers in London. Yes. So that's why you won't be able to find anything about them online anywhere. They're basically 24 of the top session singers in LA or in London that we pulled together for a few days of recording. And, they're top-notch singers as well.
And then you got to use in To the Stars, you got to use the Pembroke College Girls Choir.
Yes, I love the sounds of children's voices, and you probably know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's so sweet. It's adorable. And so I was able to find a place to include a kids choir in two different tracks,
Yeah.
and I love working with them.
You know, it's interesting for those ones because they're like, oh, look, they're into the stars. Oh, and then they go to the moon. Oh, interesting.
And there is a reason for that. Like I said, there's just a ton of connective tissue on this album. And that's just because the history of flight is just filled with connective tissue, right? So and so inspired this person to do this, and that person inspired this person to do this. That's history right there,
Yeah. You know,
especially
tracks,
scientific engineering history.
and then tracks 7, 8, and 9 were took a little bit for me to grasp onto how they fit because, you know, Oh Humanity, which of course is talking about the most famous blimp dirigible disaster of all time.
Mhm.
And then Courage, which I assumed it's about world wars, that whole era in general. And then of course Become Death is, you know, I've Become Death, Destroyer of Worlds. It's an
Yes.
interesting combination right there because it took me a little bit to figure out how does this work, but it really does because then that leads into the power of the spirit, which led into Going to the Moon.
Yes. Now let me walk you through this. So, Oh, the Humanity is about the age of airships, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I discovered when I was talking to my Kickstarter community about this album, and I was soliciting ideas from them, is a lot of people who actually work in things like aerospace wrote to me and said, "Hey, there is a very strong connection between aviation technology and the military, right? Those of us who work in aerospace, we got into this because we like, building rockets, right? But we know that someday our rockets will be used to actually carry, nuclear payload, right? That is a very common occurrence throughout the history of flight. And this is something I felt that I had to address. And so I found a speech by Ferdinand von Zeppelin, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, who invented the Zeppelin airship, right? And it starts off that piece where he says, my greatest desire is for my invention to be used for peaceful interaction between nations. It's going to increase, bring harmony to countries. It's going to increase the exchange of scientific ideals. He had a very sort of, I guess, a noble aspiration for what the Zeppelin would be. But of course, 1915 rolls around. The German government says, hey, we're going to take your airship, and instead of peaceful interaction, we're going to use it to drop bombs on London, right? So that became, I guess, the first failure of his dream of peaceful interaction. And then in 35, 36, of course, you have the Hindenburg Disaster, and that basically signaled the end of the age of airships. But what you hear after that moment of disaster is you hear the opera chorus coming in humming Sonia De Volare, right? And the reason for that is that Sonia De Volare is the dream of flight. Again and again we fall, but again and again something comes back to summon us back to our spirits, back to our feet, and to try to get back in that cockpit and resume our quest. I mean, that's, when you dig down into the lyrics, that sort of becomes a connective through line, right? Mm-hmm. Same with Become Death. Become Death, as you rightly point out, is based on the words that Robert Oppenheimer said when he first witnessed, the Trinity test explosions, right? But then right after that, you have Yuri Gagarin at the height of the Cold War in 1961 saying, people orbiting the Earth from my spacecraft, I saw how beautiful it is. People, let us preserve and enhance this beauty, not destroy it, right? The first man to leave the planet and the first man to see the Earth from outer space came back and told us this. At the height of the Cold War, at the 11th hour on the nuclear clock, when our sort of mutual mass destruction seemed like an inevitability, the first man to actually take a step back from everything and look back at us came and said, don't do this. The Earth is a beautiful place, right? And I thought that was a perfect way to follow up Become Death.
And and from there it leads to the optimism of going up into space, which I could literally see a sequel to this album about people going into space, going to Mars, going to the future, provided when we get there. I could see more continuing this one, and actually I could see several albums coming out of this. One of them I could also see is bringing up the fall coming from Divine Comedy, you could do, the way you write your music with your other albums and so on, you could do an entire album just featured on Divine Comedy. There's other things like in Purgatorio, the whole monologue about the eagle soaring through the sky, and there's more in Paradiso, and you could do a whole journey through there. Heck, it could all be in Latin. It should probably work best if it was all in Latin, if it's supposed to be Dante.
One thing I've thought about is doing a spin-off that was essentially actually the rest of the tales of Ovid's Metamorphosis. Like you mentioned Daedalus and Icarus, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's probably one of the best known stories from ancient Greek legend, but there's a lot others. And to do something that was sort of a theatrical piece like that based around Greek mythology, oh, that'd be so cool.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And you don't have to use the Greek myths that we all know, though, honestly, if you could do a song about Troy with Hector and those type of ones, that would be kind of awesome. Especially since I've been playing Total War Troy recently, and it's but the way this album is set up is definitely a lot of potential branches to go. And last time we talked to you, this album was kind of forming in your head. You were talking about how you wanted to focus on something. You said you had a project coming up, and you had an idea originally of something about flight, but it was kind of, or birds, I think you were telling me at that time. But it was forming in your brain. And I'm assuming now, especially since we have a lot more downtime than we probably ever want, I imagine you have a lot of gears spinning in your head. You said you had a project you were working on before, or had potentially to work on before everything kind of ground to a halt. How many different projects has this opened up in your mind for what you want to do now? Or are you at the point where you're like, I need to rest a little bit, breathe, get some sleep?
I'm already on to the next thing, honestly. The next thing is to revisit the birds idea. I want to write what's basically a mass for animal extinction. What's a better way to put this? Like basically a requiem mass for the species that we've driven to extinction through man-made either deforestation or hunting or climate change or whatever. I don't know that that's been done before, but it's something that appeals to me as somebody who's very sort of environmentally minded, but also just there's a lot of poetry in birds, and it's in a way a softer follow-up to an album like To Shiver the Sky, which when you talk about the history of flight, you're talking huge sounds, right? You're talking propellers and bombs and rockets taking off. Something like an album about birds, it's softer. We're talking like the sonic world of birds is chirping and sounds and wings fluttering and things like that. It's a much different experience sonically, and that's what I'm sort of looking to explore in my next album.
That sounds like it would be amazing. I can hear, in my brain, I grew up in Alaska, so we, geese migration was always a big thing. And when geese come in and go out, there's always a specific sound. There's lots of bald eagles up there. Bald eagles themselves are very different creatures. When they're flying overhead, you kind of just pay attention because they are, they're hunting, they're circling, their flight's very different. While meanwhile here in Arizona, we'll see a hummingbird outside, and it's just mesmerized by the fact that it's beating so hard to stand still. Yeah. All these different birds, and of course, I have family in New Zealand as well, and you have the kiwi bird, which is a very different type of bird.
Yeah.
or the kia, all the, or of course, you can always have penguins. Penguins are always fun. People love penguins. People
love penguins, right?
And all the different sounds that these different birds have, because kind of like Peter and the Wolf, the duck sound is very different than the wolf. Not that you'd necessarily have the duck sound like that, but I can definitely see how that would definitely lend itself to something very powerful and fun.
Yeah, definitely. I want a little more. This was a very serious work, To Shiver the Sky. It's full of grand ideas about monumental human achievements, like putting a man on the moon, and it's full of like heavy literary and religious reference and death. It's full of death. It's a very, very serious, intense work. I'd like to follow it up with something a little lighter and more fun, I think. And I think birds are the ticket.
Yeah, one thing I think would be a really interesting challenge, being that you're in California, I don't know how you'd capture the sound of a condor, but there's a lot of tragedy in condors, but I don't know how you could capture that, because condors are not very pretty birds.
I don't know. I mean, we're at, like,
Yeah,
we're the
I'm
very
just throwing
earliest.
ideas right now, but it's like I've never heard of anyone trying to think of what it, because there's been documentaries with birds, some very famous ones that have won Academy Awards, where you have like the sound of the flutes and the light strings that usually accompany birds on something on BBC.
Yeah.
But something for like a condor that is a bird that is basically dead, what would that sound be?
I don't know. I have to think about that. I mean, the way I look at it, I mean, I'm looking at, for example, species like the passenger pigeon, right? Which used to number in the billions, kind of at the end of the 19th century. And then um, we Americans sort of discovered a taste for them, and they become a cheap and easy to obtain food source. And with the development of the railroads and refrigerated cars, suddenly you could hunt and you could hunt passenger pigeons, in Ohio, put them on a refrigerated train and get them to New York, and they would be a viable food source for people in New York. And this led just to their extinction. I mean, it didn't take long, just a couple of decades, but their population plummeted from the billions to essentially nothing. And that's amazing to me, that we could drive birds to extinction, just like that, just like that. And I'm often sort of mesmerized by, you've probably seen these like, videos of like murmurations of starlings, like European starlings, and the amazing shapes that they form in the sky that sort of undulate. Like, that is beautiful to me. And the other thing is, like, I've been exploring this idea of, like, the canary, right, and what the canary symbolizes, especially since there's a bit of a sort of an extinction overtone to all of this, right? The canary in the coal mine is, of course, the bird that we let die so that we know that we're in trouble, right? I mean, in a way, the extinction of animal species, the loss of biodiversity, it's the canary that's signaling, I guess, the eventual extinction of humans as well. So these are just very early concepts I have in my mind. I mean, the road to creating something like this is so long. You get a kernel of an idea, and maybe you have some musical ideas. Like, musical ideas are never in short supply. I have tons of musical ideas. That's what I do. I'm a composer, right? You put me in front of a piano, and I'll have a piece for you, within an hour, right? But like the sort of deeper, higher level intellectual ideas are what require the most research. And not only that, but finding those exact texts that represent what you want to say and how you want to say it. That's where the real challenge in putting together a choral album, especially it's something that's essentially, a requiem mass for extinction. You have to really ask yourself, what does it mean to write a requiem mass in the year 2020 or 2021 when I actually start writing this? Like, what does that mean? What shape does that take? Do you take into consideration the history of the requiem mass? Do you take into consideration, what sections do you include in the text? Like, do you alternate between the requiem structure and sort of like poetry, the way that Benjamin Britten did with his war requiem, or do you just make it a purely, just call it a requiem and make it purely, based on non-religious sources, or do you do your Kyrie, your Pie Jesu, and your all your different movements? I mean, it's all of these sorts of like architectural, sort of intellectual concepts are what I need to tackle next, and they take a long time to think through.
And with that, let's take a pause right here as we end part 1 of our interview with Christopher Tin. If you want more with Christopher Tin, stay tuned later in the week as we release part 2 of our newest 2020 interview with this fantastic composer.